Today's sermon is titled Weave Us Together. We Care UU and the Caring Team, to be delivered by Rebecca Hendricks, and connects with Principle 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, Principle 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, Principle 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, and Principle 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Rebecca has been a member for almost a year. She often talks and writes about growing up on Minnesota prairies and jokes that she went to school with Laura Ingalls Wilder in the 1860s. But she has often thought about the impact of growing up in small towns where many people live their entire lives and are interdependent with the same neighbors from birth to death. Rebecca?
I was a fortunate recipient of Diane DeMarco's phone call last spring, asking if I would be interested in joining an ad hoc committee, later named We Care UU. During the difficult times of COVID, it seemed to make sense to check in with UU congregants, and Janet Cooper later suggested we also use this opportunity to confirm who was on what committee and encourage people to consider membership on another committee or to join a group for the first time. We brainstormed names like Couch Caring, Pulse Keepers, Two Gathered, but Dolores Miera came up with the winner. Diane wrote up wonderful reminders for effective communication and a list of questions for gathering information. Our group spent the next several months contacting members and friends of UUCC and staying in touch as requested, updating participation lists, finding additional committee members and subcommittee members, checking in to see if folks needed help or services, and later requesting input and comments about how UU was serving the needs of their members during COVID and overall. This morning, our theme is caring, and it is a time to review the work of We Care UU and explain the newly formed caring team. We hope our efforts will be meaningful in the life of this community. Before I present the team details, I'd like to talk a bit about caring in my personal life. Ted and I lived in the Bay Area for 30 years before retiring to Cambria. In late October of this year, 3 of my dear friends from the Congregational Church of San Jose lost their mothers on the same day. All 3 moms were in their 90s and had lived full, rich lives, and each is being celebrated for being loving and caring to all around them. I've spent time recently thinking about my mother, who died much younger, over 30 years ago, and who shared her caring nature with all who knew her. This is a woman who, on her wedding day in 1950, was reminded by her loving but firm father, "Wilda, this is a special day for you, and I want you to enjoy it. But don't forget about your guests. It's our responsibility to welcome them and make sure they have a wonderful time." As she raised her 4 children and worked as a teacher, secretary, bookkeeper, and volunteer, she constantly showed how much she cared for the people in the world around her. My mom didn't sleep a great deal. She was up by 5:30, and long before we were awake, she had written a handful of cards, condolence, birthday, thinking of you, and would have whomped up a batch of cookies and baked an extra hot dish to deliver to someone at lunch. Those early morning activities were the core of her caring persona. She loved to entertain and would frequently invite all the single high school teachers over for Friday dinners, most famously the 70s fondue parties. Steak, chicken, and wieners cooking in Harvest gold-colored pots of bubbling oil, chunks of bread covered in Gruyere cheese, only to be followed by forks with strawberry pound cake and angel food pieces dipped into warm, melted chocolate. Mother knew that being a young single teacher in a remote town of 2,000 was not always easy, and a social life was difficult to come by. Every Sunday, a pot roast with carrots, potatoes, and onions went in the oven before we walked to church, and Mom would scan the congregation to see who needed an invitation to dinner. Typically the proverbial little old ladies, often long widowed, and eager to enjoy time and food with a family. Thanksgiving and Christmas always included an invitation to George Label, an affable, lifelong bachelor who enjoyed spending holidays with our family. And the bonus for us was his gift of a 2-pound box of Fannie Farmer chocolate, the Minnesota equivalent of See's candy. But in addition to everyday kindnesses like these, I remember specific occasions where she went so above and beyond, where others might not even have thought of traveling. When I was in junior high, a young mother died of cancer, leaving her grieving husband and 2 boys around 8 and 2. Gil, the father, could not cope on his own after the funeral, and my mother just scooped up little Cameron and brought him home for months. We loved cuddling and caring for him, and though Gil and his older son would often come over to dinner and spend weekly time with Cammie, my mom made it possible for Gil to grieve his loss, get back to work, and take care of his older son. At the time, I know I gave little thought to the magnanimous gift Mom gave to that family during an incredibly difficult time. A few years later, in a smaller, even more rural Minnesota town, our minister and his wife had a new baby boy with unrelenting colic. Knowing that Norm and Sybil were exhausted from lack of sleep and chasing a 4-year-old, Mom would bring Christopher home night after night, and she would walk the house, singing and whispering to him while we slept upstairs. Norm and Sybil were eternally grateful for this desperately needed respite care, although my mother would thank them for the gift of those nighttime hours when she could once again cradle a baby in her arms. Although my mother was desperately unhappy in this remote farming town that rarely treated outsiders kindly, she poured her energy into making life a little bit better for those around her. She had left a town in which she had a halcyon social group: church, teaching, Eastern Star, neighborhood. She had no idea how difficult it would be to create friendships and emotional connections like she had enjoyed throughout her marriage. This was a town that labeled a low-income senior retirement project as communist in the late 60s. Her first meeting of the local Eastern Star group revealed its racist inclinations, and she went home heartbroken. My dad was gone 4 evenings a week, and winter fuel costs meant bundling up in a 55 to 60-degree house in the evenings. 3 of her 4 children were struggling to adapt to school in a new environment, and she was unable to be a teacher due to an archaic district regulation about spouses working in the same school district. It would have been tempting to stay home and hide. Instead, she looked for every opportunity to enrich our lives with new people and experiences, not an easy task on the Minnesota prairie populated solely with conservative white Scandinavians descended from Northern European immigrants in the 1800s. When a Japanese teacher visited Granite Falls to observe English classes, Mom volunteered our home for his 6-week stay. Mr. Akio Ito wrote our names in Japanese, taught us to count to 10, and shared the rich history and culture of his exotic homeland. When an Indian doctor and minister from Bombay, now Mumbai, visited through the church, Mom learned how to make vegetarian meals and curried specialties. I was a pen pal with Dr. Bansali's daughter through high school, whetting my appetite for a visit to India, which I was able to make years later. During my junior year in high school, we invited an exchange student into our home. Karen from Melbourne, Australia, was a perfect fit for our family, and Mom was delighted to welcome another daughter. She and Karen just clicked. They had a mutual love of Shakespeare and the theater, reading and poetry, piano and singing. My mother didn't work outside the home that year, so she could take Karen to her outings and presentations. They stayed in close touch and visited each other until my mom died. And Karen never doubted that she had 2 moms in her life. When I headed off to college, Mom was down to 2 teenagers, a cat, a full-time job, dinners for Dad, and ongoing volunteer activities. But she wrote to my sister and me twice weekly, sharing church news, town gossip, and mundane happenings from out on the prairie. And soon after the school year started, she became aware that a German exchange student was miserable in a mismatched living situation. Mom talked with the family and the school advisor, and by the next day, Hucky was the newest member of the Hendricks family for the remainder of his year away from home. He was a sensitive, homesick, self-conscious, gay teenager who bloomed in Mom's lap of love. She spent time with him, built his confidence, encouraged his writing, affirmed his sexual orientation in a community that was not open and affirming, to say the least, and created a safe haven for him at 742 3rd Street, home to a truly caring mother. During the Vietnam War, she wrote to the White House almost daily, imploring the Nixon administration to end the war and bring the troops home. We were all convinced there was a thick file someplace in J. Edgar Hoover's office labeled Wilda Mary Hendricks, Minnesota dissident. Looking back, I knew my mother was a kind, empathetic person, but I realized that if I could assign a single word to her place in this world, it would be caring, feeling or showing for, or kindness to others. I hope my efforts with We Care UU and the Caring team serve as a small offering to her amazing legacy of love. So now let's take a look. The ad hoc Caring We Care UU committee was made up of the 5 of us that you see on the screen, and Dolores Miera was later replaced by Anita Hoopscher. We developed 4 objectives for our outreach: to check in with each member or friend to see how they are doing during COVID, to offer any needed assistance or services, and we're fortunate enough to have a list of willing volunteers, to broaden the volunteer network currently responsible for the ongoing operation of our church community, and to update the list of members on all committees, subcommittees, and teams. Later in the summer, we agreed to gather comments and concerns, not only how the church was responding during COVID isolation, but anything that UCC could be doing more of, less of, or differently as we move forward. We divided the congregation and friends into 5 groups, a list of names assigned to each of us. This list has not been shared with anyone else in the congregation. We spent a great deal of time talking about how we would approach this interviewing process, including how to communicate this activity to the congregation. We asked Treva to distribute a memo to members and friends describing what would be happening. How to start a conversation so that people understood our goals and felt comfortable sharing their concerns and opinions, whether they be positive, negative, or whatever. How to ask questions without implying a right or wrong answer, and encouraging the sharing of opinions, feelings, and information. How to listen without interrupting or judging, and capturing thoughts and comments as verbatim as possible. And how to respect any input, knowing that feedback is a gift, and organizations become healthier, stronger, and more resilient when they hear what isn't working as well as what is. I've spent over 30 years conducting training sessions and making presentations. In almost every class connected to effective communication, I review and talk about giving and receiving feedback. The board is currently receiving and exploring our feedback. Lay leaders and all of you will be receiving feedback as time goes on. So here are the criteria I cover about receiving feedback: to ask for it, guide it, replace defensiveness with curiosity, and keep what is useful, discard the rest. The example I always used in my teaching was asking my manager to give me feedback on a presentation to Cupertino supervisors. I knew if I asked Phil for feedback after the presentation was over, he would just say, "Great job, well done." If I really wanted quality feedback, I had to ask him well before the scheduled talk. And with Phil, I knew I needed to suggest areas for his feedback. "Hey, I would appreciate hearing if you think I present the budget in a logical manner. And you know, I often talk too fast, so could you notice my pace? Anything else would be great too." Then afterwards, if he tells me that I was talking at a great clip, it's important that I don't respond with, "Well, that wasn't my fault. I mean, Jim took up part of my time and the projector needed adjusting." Instead of defending, justifying, or blaming, I need to get curious. So, was my speaking pace too fast the entire presentation or just in certain places? What slide changes would you recommend to make it easier to follow? This third point has been an invaluable tool for me. It illustrates openness to feedback and usually solicits excellent information or suggestions to improve future performance. In fact, and I'm adding this just before church, Treva and I were talking, and she talked about, and she hopefully will explain them to the board and other people later, what ifs. So that idea of not getting defensive, but the curiosity can be in the form of, what if we tried this differently? What if we didn't do this any longer? It doesn't seem to be a fit. What if we tried that? And I loved that. What if is a beautiful actuality of that idea of curiosity. Then keep what is useful and discard the rest. Be sure not to discard feedback too quickly, especially if it's been hard to hear, if it's pushed those buttons. Sometimes, however, feedback needs to be heard and discarded. I well remember teaching a class in the field back in the 80s when I was a relative unknown to my US customer service population. A young man who had not wanted to attend the mandatory training, and all of my field were men, and I was the only woman they knew from Cupertino, came up to me at the end of the day and stated, "You're too short to be an effective trainer." Well, my only response was, "Thank you for your feedback, and it was good to work with you today." And then I mentally took that comment, carried it over to the door, and threw it into the wastebasket as I left the room. Looking at these criteria, the planning and advanced communication of We Care UU address the first two bullets, ask for it and guide it. The board will need to do likewise with the summary of comments. I like to compare receiving feedback to waking up on your birthday. You have 3 presents on the breakfast table. You open the first. It's beautiful. It's perfect, and you love it. And what do you say to the person who gave it to you? Thank you. You open the second. It's okay. Not quite what you wanted, but you might use it. And what do you say to the giver? Thank you. Then you open the third, and it's awful. You will never use it. And as soon as Aunt Tilly backs out of the driveway, you're headed to Goodwill. And what do you say to Aunt Tilly? You still say thank you. We look to the board to accept all comments, whether they are perceived as positive, negative, whatever, to be valued input to the UUCC community, knowing that any comment might be valuable in moving an organization forward. We're not looking to judge comments. All input is useful and should be considered. In fact, in my experience, the most negative or critical comments often offer the most revealing and helpful opportunities for an organization to look inward and think about self-improvement. And all of us on We Care UU were most appreciative of the time and effort of each person we interviewed. Thank you for your thoughtful sharing of comments and concerns. We know that the board and lay leaders share that also. We Care UU also differentiated between anonymity and confidentiality. Just to review, anonymity means not including names that are connected with the survey. Confidentiality is not sharing information with anyone. Each interviewer listed and submitted all comments anonymously, not including any names with the input. And so our report to the board was anonymous, but not confidential. I was responsible for compiling the data and typing the report that was submitted to the board. The data lent itself to being organized into categories, which you'll see in a moment on the next slide. It is important for you to know that any individual that submitted comments in 2 or more areas would have their opinions separated into different categories. Please know that any individual should not be able to be identified based on their specific comments unless he or she chose to present identifying information. In my career in human resources, I have been responsible for a number of surveys: employee, vendor, user, many variations of the activity that asks individuals to trust an organization, to receive feedback, and to act upon it. I care greatly about the integrity of this process, making sure recipients know that the process, ground rules, and anticipated outcomes, exactly what they are anytime they're asked for opinions. Fortunately, We Care UU cared about this too. Should we repeat the survey process in the future, we will make any changes to create an even more effective process. So your combined input was forwarded to the board soon after their October meeting. Your comments, concerns, and suggestions naturally fell into 5 categories, and we didn't leave any comments out. So the 5 categories are how things are going during this time of COVID, the Zoom services to which you have been so dedicated, overall input, maybe that was the miscellaneous category, the bylaw update process, and comments about our process, the We Care UU process, to gather input and suggestions. The board has been reviewing this summary and is in the process of creating a summary of action items to be communicated to the congregation. We look forward to the board's review of your comments and their list of suggestions for moving forward. After our ad hoc committee had submitted our report, we talked about continuing some of our work as a new team. We wanted to keep communicating with people, maybe send out cards, check in with members and friends we hadn't seen for a while, and to be involved in any future surveys the board might deem appropriate. We submitted a proposal to the board for a new caring team, and the board approved the proposal at their October meeting. So the caring team, as it stands now, is responsible to the Congregational Life Committee. Anita Hoopsher is our brave leader, and Sue Davis and I round out the trio. We meet as needed, and as you can see, we hope to have a minimal impact on the budget. So responsibilities are indeed to send cards to anyone in the congregation who has a care, joy, concern, loss, or other life event, to contact any members or friends who have not been attending services to make sure they're okay, so they know we're thinking of them and willing to provide services or help if needed. Provide these services as we are able to anyone requesting them, utilizing our budget, and even more, the list of wonderful members and friends that we have as volunteers. Continue to contact a number of members or friends from our COVID call list who have appreciated our regular phone calls. Assist the board to complete the interview process as needed, and implement future survey changes really based on a defined, effective process to solicit input and follow through with communication, feedback, and changes. As the caring team, we welcome your questions, suggestions, and any other input that might help weave us together in love now and in the future.